The Zephyrian Imperium had mastered faster-than-light travel, perfected energy manipulation on a stellar scale, and developed military tactics, so elegant they were studied as art forms in 17 different galaxies. Their war machines could crack planets like eggs, their battle formations moved with the precision of clockwork, and their strategic planning algorithms could predict enemy movements with 97% accuracy. Naturally, this made their ongoing difficulties with humans deeply embarrassing. It wasn't that humans posed any real threat, mind you. Humanity's entire spacefaring civilization was roughly equivalent to what the Zephyrians had achieved during their equivalent of the Bronze Age, if the Bronze Age had involved crude chemical rockets and an inexplicable obsession with caffeinated beverages. Human weapons were primitive, their ships were barely functional, and their tactical doctrine appeared to consist primarily of shoot at it until it stops moving, then shoot at it some more to be sure. The problem was that humans seemed to have missed the memo about being conquered. Fleet Admiral Korrath of the 3rd Expeditionary Force had been attempting to explain this concept to the human colonies in the Kepler system for the better part of 8 standard months. The explanation process involved surrounding their pathetic little mining station with enough firepower to sterilize continents, broadcasting surrender demands in 47 languages, and demonstrating superior technology through increasingly elaborate displays of military might. The humans had responded by barricading themselves inside their ramshackle station, jury-rigging defensive systems that shouldn't have worked but somehow did, and sending back messages that roughly translated to "come and take it, if you think you're hard enough." It was insulting. It was irrational. It was completely contrary to established patterns of civilized warfare, where vastly outmatched opponents had the basic courtesy to recognize mathematical reality and surrender gracefully. It was also, Korrath was beginning to suspect, somehow working. Not in any tactical sense that his strategic computers could quantify, but in the much more troubling sense that his entire fleet was now talking about these humans with a mixture of exasperation and grudging respect. The mining station's defenders had somehow managed to turn their inevitable defeat into a months-long exercise in creative problem-solving, jury-rigged engineering, and what could only be described as weaponized stubbornness. Admiral Korrath stood 8 feet tall in his dress uniform, possessed cranial ridges that marked him as descended from the warrior caste, and had personally conquered 12 star systems without losing a single engagement. His tactical brilliance was legendary, his strategic foresight unmatched, and his ability to maintain fleet discipline was the stuff of military academy textbooks. Which made this morning's crisis all the more problematic. His hatchlings were missing. Not just any hatchlings, either. Nix and Vora, his twin offspring, the genetic legacy of his bloodline and currently the cause of what humans would probably call a panic attack. They had vanished from their secured quarters sometime during the night cycle, leaving behind only a small hole chewed through the environmental control grating and what appeared to be deliberately scattered toys. The hole was exactly the right size for curious 6-year-old Zephyrian hatchlings, which suggested either remarkable coincidence or the kind of premeditated mischief that Korrath was beginning to suspect ran in the family. He had immediately ordered a ship-wide search, which was absolutely the correct response according to both military protocol and parental instinct. What was less correct was the way his concentration had completely evaporated, leaving him unable to focus on siege operations while his offspring were unaccounted for somewhere in the labyrinthine depths of a star dreadnought. Sir, his aide, Commander Thylex, materialized at his elbow with the kind of precise timing that suggested either psychic abilities or very careful monitoring of his commander's stress indicators. Search teams have completed sweeps of decks 12 through 20. No sign of the young ones. What about the restricted sections? Also clear, sir. Engineering reports no unauthorized access to critical systems, though they did find what appeared to be small claw marks near the waste recycling units. Thylex paused delicately. The marks were accompanied by what our analysis identified as giggling sounds on the security recordings. Korrath felt his secondary circulatory system do something that might have been the Zephyrian equivalent of skipping a beat. His hatchlings had been giggling while exploring unauthorized areas of his flagship. This suggested a level of fearlessness that was either admirable or terrifying, depending on one's perspective. Any other anomalies? Well, sir, there was one unusual report from the detention section. Of course there was. Because if his hatchlings were going to go exploring, they would naturally head straight for the one area of the ship that contained unpredictable humans who might react to small Zephyrian children in any number of alarming ways. What kind of unusual report? The security monitors detected what appeared to be unauthorized thermal signatures in cell block 7. The duty officer initially assumed it was a sensor malfunction, but when he investigated, he reported hearing what he described as soft musical sounds coming from one of the cells. Musical sounds. From a detention block, where they kept captured humans who were supposed to be brooding about their inevitable defeat, not composing impromptu concerts. "Take me there," Korrath commanded. Immediately. The journey through his own ship felt like traveling through increasingly hostile territory. Crew members snapped to attention as he passed, but their expressions held the kind of careful neutrality that suggested word of the missing hatchlings had spread throughout the fleet. Everyone knew that a Zephyrian admiral separated from his offspring was approximately as stable as an antimatter containment field with a failing power source. Detention Block 7 was located deep in the ship's security section, surrounded by enough defensive measures to contain a small army of hostile prisoners. The cells themselves were designed to be escape-proof, comfortable enough to prevent unnecessary suffering, and monitored by sensor arrays that could detect a prisoner's emotional state from 3 decks away, which made the current readings from cell designation Omega 12 particularly baffling. So, the detention duty officer, a young Zephyrian named Blex, was practically vibrating with nervous energy. The bioscanners are showing the expected human life signs from the prisoner, but also 2 additional heat signatures that match the genetic profile of your hatchlings. And so, the acoustic sensors are detecting sounds that our translation matrix identifies as something called lullabies. Korrath stared at the cell door as if it might spontaneously provide explanations. Behind that barrier of reinforced composite and energy containment fields, his hatchlings were apparently being subjected to human lullabies. This was either the most bizarre kidnapping in galactic history or something even more incomprehensible. What do we know about this prisoner? Private Marcus Chen, Terran Colonial Marines, captured during the raid on Supply Depot Gamma. Standard interrogation revealed nothing of tactical value beyond an extensive knowledge of something called vintage Earth music and an apparently sincere belief that this entire war could be resolved through better communication and maybe some decent coffee. That sounded disturbingly typical of human prisoner behavior. Zephyrian captives focused on escape plans, tactical analysis, or maintaining dignified silence. Human captives seemed to focus on sharing cultural information, critiquing their accommodations, and offering unsolicited advice about conflict resolution. "Open the cell," Korrath ordered. The massive door slid aside with a barely audible hiss, revealing a scene that would fundamentally challenge Korrath's understanding of interspecies relations for the rest of his considerable lifespan. The human prisoner was sitting cross-legged on his narrow bunk, back against the cell wall, with both of Korrath's hatchlings curled up against his sides like small, scale cats. Nix had somehow arranged himself so that his head was pillowed on the human's thigh, while Vora was tucked under the human's arm with her tail wrapped around his wrist. Both hatchlings appeared to be deeply asleep, making soft thrumming sounds that indicated complete contentment. The human himself was quietly humming something melodic and complex, occasionally stroking the hatchling's head ridges with a kind of gentle, automatic care that suggested long practice with small creatures. His expression was peaceful, focused, and completely unsurprised by the appearance of a heavily armed Zephyrian admiral in his cell doorway. "Morning, Admiral," Chen said conversationally, not stopping his gentle ministrations. "I'm guessing these little ones belong to you." The casual tone, combined with the sight of his offspring obviously enjoying themselves in enemy captivity, created a cognitive dissonance that made Korrath's tactical assessment protocols produce error messages. "Private Chen," he said carefully, "perhaps you could explain how my hatchlings came to be in your cell." Chen considered this question with a kind of thoughtful attention usually reserved for matters of strategic importance. "Well, so, I was trying to get some sleep when I heard scratching sounds coming from the air vent. Figured it was maintenance work or maybe some kind of pest problem. Then these 2 came tumbling out, looking lost and scared. And your response was to take care of them." Chen said this as if it were the most obvious course of action in the known universe. They were making these little distressed chirping sounds, and they looked hungry. So I shared my meal rations, gave them some water, and sang a few songs until they calmed down. Korrath looked at his hatchlings, who had indeed calmed down to the point where they seemed to be using the human as a combination pillow, heating pad, and security blanket. Private, are you aware that those are Zephyrian warcast hatchlings? Their claws can pierce battle armor. Their bite pressure can crack reinforced ceramics. They are specifically bred for combat effectiveness. Yeah, I could tell they were your species, Chen replied easily. They've got your bone structure and your attitude. Very determined little kids. Also very smart. Took them about 10 minutes to figure out which pockets I keep my spare food in. Their attitude. Well, they decided they were going to sleep here, and they weren't taking any arguments about it. Kept climbing back onto the bunk every time I tried to put them down. Eventually I figured it was easier to just roll with it. The human's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. Reminds me of my nephews back on Earth. Same energy, just with better natural weapons. This was not processing correctly in Korrath's strategic analysis matrix. Hatchlings did not simply adopt enemy prisoners. Prisoners did not casually compare enemy offspring to their own family members. None of this followed any known pattern of civilized behavior. Private, he said slowly, do you understand that we are at war? That I am currently besieging your people with the intent of bringing them under Zephyrian authority? Yeah, I got that part, Chen acknowledged without any apparent concern. But these little ones don't know anything about politics. Far as they are concerned, they found someone willing to share food and sing songs. That's pretty much all kids care about, whatever planet they are from. The human shifted slightly to accommodate Vora's position without waking her, and Korrath noticed details that made his parental assessment subroutines activate in uncomfortable ways. Chen's uniform showed multiple small tears from tiny claws, but the tears had been carefully mended with what appeared to be improvised thread. More significantly, the human's hands showed fresh scratches and bite marks that were healing naturally, suggesting he had allowed the hatchlings to explore and test boundaries without retaliation. They injured you, Korrath observed. Just figuring out the rules, Chen replied with a slight shrug. Kids test limits. You let them know what's acceptable and what isn't, and they adapt pretty quick. These two are exceptionally bright. Probably gifted, if I had to guess. This casual assessment of Zephyrian genetic potential by an enemy combatant was surreal enough that Korrath felt his worldview shifting in directions he hadn't anticipated. And you simply accepted this behavior. Admiral, with all due respect, they are babies. I wasn't going to hote a couple of scared kids just because we're on different sides of a conflict. Chen's voice carried a matter-of-fact certainty that somehow made Korrath feel like the unreasonable party in this exchange. Besides, they're excellent company. Don't complain about the food, don't ask difficult questions about military strategy, and they're surprisingly good at harmonizing. Harmonizing. They've got natural musical ability. Perfect pitch, actually. We've been working on some Earth folk songs, and they pick up melody lines faster than most adult humans. Chen's expression grew thoughtful. You know, Admiral, you should be proud. These are remarkable children. The compliment hit harder than expected, partly because it was genuine and partly because Korrath couldn't remember the last time someone had simply praised his hatchlings for being themselves rather than evaluating their combat potential or genetic optimization parameters. Sir, Thylex whispered from behind him, what are your orders? That was an excellent question. Military doctrine demanded immediate retrieval of the hatchlings and return to proper Zephyrian care protocols. Parental observation, however, was noting that Nix and Vora looked more relaxed and content than they had since their mother's death in the Hegemony War 2 years ago. Private Chen, he said finally, my hatchlings appear to have formed an attachment to you. They are good kids, Chen replied simply. They just needed someone to pay attention to them. Listen to their stories, answer their questions, treat them like they matter. The implied criticism in that statement struck deeper than any tactical analysis. When exactly had he last spent time with his hatchlings that wasn't related to their education protocols or genetic enhancement schedules? When had he last simply listened to them without evaluating their development progress? Dad. The word came from Nix, who had apparently decided to join the conversation without fully waking up. In sleepy but perfect Zephyrian, He added, Chen knows songs about creatures called dolphins that are smart and playful and live in water. Can we see dolphins someday? This innocent question detonated in the cell's atmosphere like a tactical explosive. Several realizations crystallized simultaneously in Korrath's consciousness, none of them comfortable. His hatchlings were curious about alien cultures in ways that their formal education had never addressed. They were starved for attention that didn't involve performance evaluations. And they had apparently learned more about interspecies diversity from one human prisoner than from years of imperial xenobiology courses. Also, Nix continued with the devastating honesty of the very young. Chen says dolphins get to play all day, and their families stay together forever. That sounds nice. The forever part sounds especially nice, Vora added drowsily, somehow managing to burrow deeper into Chen's protective embrace without fully awakening. Can our family stay together forever too, Dad? Korrath felt something that might have been his heart stopping, if Zephyrians had hearts in the same sense as other species. His hatchling's mother had died in battle, leaving them in the care of military protocols and automated systems that prioritized efficiency over emotional connection. He had been so focused on his duties as Fleet Admiral that he had somehow failed to notice they were growing up without the kind of family stability they clearly craved. Private Chen, he said formally, what is your professional assessment of this situation? The human considered this with the same serious attention he had given every previous question. Well, Admiral, from where I'm sitting, it looks like your kids were looking for something they weren't getting through normal channels. Found it with me, at least temporarily. Question is, what happens next? What do you recommend? So, I'm a captured enemy combatant giving parenting advice to a Zephyrian fleet admiral, while babysitting his children. I'm pretty sure this whole situation has moved well beyond normal military protocols. Chen adjusted his position to better support his small charges, moving with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to sleeping human furniture duties. But if you want my honest opinion, these little ones need more than educational efficiency. They need someone who has time to just be present with them. The accuracy of that assessment was both undeniable and professionally devastating. Korrath had been an exemplary military commander and an absent father, and somehow this enemy prisoner had managed to provide what he couldn't in the space of a single sleep cycle. Thylex, he said without taking his eyes off the hatchlings, suspend all siege operations for the next 48 hours. So, you heard correctly. Stand down all offensive actions against the mining station. I need to reassess our strategic priorities. What he actually needed was to figure out how to be a parent instead of just a military officer, but that wasn't the kind of admission one made in front of subordinates, even subordinates who are currently watching their commanding officer get schooled in child-rearing by a captured human. There is one complication, Chen said thoughtfully. I don't think they are planning to let me go anywhere anytime soon. This was, Korrath realized, absolutely accurate. Both hatchlings had arranged themselves with the practiced efficiency of small beings who understood that possession was 9/10 of galactic law. Nix had somehow managed to grip Chen's uniform in a way that would require careful extraction, while Vora had gone completely limp in the universal child strategy of becoming immovable through strategic limpness. Dad, Nix said hopefully, eyes still closed, can Chen come eat dinner with us? He knows stories about Earth food called ice cream, and I think we should research this phenomenon thoroughly. Ice cream is apparently frozen milk with flavoring, Vora added with the authority of someone who had clearly received comprehensive briefings on human culinary culture. But Chen says the important part isn't the ingredients, it's sharing it with people you care about. I would like to share ice cream with people I care about, Nix decided with a kind of absolute certainty that only children could achieve. Chen is people I care about now. Korrath felt something that might have been a migraine developing, if Zephyrians got migraines, which they definitely did when dealing with hatchlings who had been culturally contaminated by human prisoners. Private, have you been conducting unauthorized cultural exchange seminars with my children? They asked questions, Chen replied reasonably. Kids are naturally curious. Would you rather I had ignored them? The honest answer was that Korrath didn't know what he would have preferred, because this entire scenario was so far outside his military training that his tactical databases were returning null values. What he did know was that his hatchlings were demonstrably happy, obviously safe, and making contented sounds he hadn't heard since before their mother's death. "Sir," Thylex said quietly, "the crew is requesting clarification on new operational parameters regarding the siege." Korrath looked at his aide, then at the human who had somehow achieved more effective childcare in one night than the Zephyrian military's most advanced automated systems had managed in 2 years, then at his hatchlings who were clearly prepared to defend their chosen human against any attempt at separation. "Tell the crew," he said finally, "that we're implementing experimental cultural liaison protocols. Effective immediately, Private Chen is being reassigned to special consulting status." Consulting on what, so? That was another excellent question. Korrath was improvising faster than his strategic planning algorithms could compensate, which was not how Zephyrian military operations typically functioned. But then again, nothing about this situation was typical. Interspecies relations, he said, the explanation forming as he spoke. If we're going to effectively administrate human populations, we need better understanding of human behavioral patterns. The private will be advising on civilian integration strategies. It was a completely absurd justification, and everyone in the detention cell understood this. It was also the kind of absurd justification that might actually be defensible, given that the Zephyrian High Command had been consistently mystified by human resistance patterns throughout this entire campaign. "Does this mean I get better accommodations?" Chen asked mildly. "Because these two are going to need more space as they grow, and this cell wasn't really designed for family activities." "It means," Korrath said, making what was probably the most strategically questionable decision of his distinguished career, "that you get whatever accommodations are necessary to ensure the continued well-being of my hatchlings." "Can we get ice cream?" Nix asked hopefully, finally opening his eyes. "I'll investigate the possibility of ice cream," Korrath promised, despite having no idea how to obtain frozen dairy products in the middle of a military campaign. "And can Chen teach us more Earth songs?" "Yes, Chen can teach you more Earth songs." "And can we learn about dolphins?" "We'll arrange educational materials about dolphins." "And can Chen stay with us forever?" Vora asked with the kind of devastating directness that only children possessed. That question hung in the detention cell's atmosphere like unexploded ordnance. Korrath looked at his hatchlings, then at the human who had somehow become the most important member of his crew despite being technically an enemy prisoner, then at the impossible situation that had developed from what should have been a routine siege operation. "We'll work something out," he said finally, which was probably the most diplomatically evasive answer he had ever given to a direct question from his children. "I think that means yes," Chen said quietly to the hatchlings, and Korrath realized that the human had somehow understood the subtext of military necessity, parental desperation, and emotional attachment that made any other answer impossible. "Sir," Thylex said carefully, "should I inform Fleet Command about these new arrangements?" Korrath considered this question while watching his hatchlings settle back into their chosen configuration with obvious satisfaction. Fleet Command would definitely have opinions about admirals who suspended military operations to accommodate their children's attachment to enemy combatants. Those opinions would likely be negative and potentially career-ending. On the other hand, his hatchlings were making those soft thrumming sounds again, and Chen was resuming his quiet humming, and for the first time in 2 years, his family felt complete. "Tell Fleet Command that we're implementing a new approach to human pacification based on cultural integration rather than pure military dominance," he said finally. "Experimental protocols designed to achieve more efficient long-term compliance through improved understanding of human social dynamics. And if they request detailed reports, tell them the detailed reports are classified pending completion of the initial experimental phase." Korrath looked down at his children, who had somehow arranged themselves even more securely against their chosen human. "But Thylex, make sure our cultural consultant gets appropriate quarters. And find out what ice cream actually is. Apparently it's strategically significant." "Yes, sir." As his aide departed to begin the complex process of explaining the inexplicable to military bureaucracy, Korrath remained in the detention cell, watching his children achieve the kind of peaceful contentment that 2 years of optimal military care had failed to provide. The siege of mining station Kepler 447 could wait indefinitely. After 8 months of trying to understand human behavior through tactical analysis, he had learned more in one morning by simply observing a human interact with hatchlings who needed care rather than education. It was, he reflected, probably the most tactically valuable intelligence he had gathered since the campaign began, even if it meant learning to live with the sound of Earth folk songs echoing through the corridors of a Zephyrian star dreadnought. The hatchlings thrummed louder, as if expressing approval of his decision. And in the quiet of what had once been a detention cell but was rapidly becoming something more like a nursery, Admiral Korrath began to understand that perhaps the most dangerous thing about humans wasn't their primitive weapons or their stubborn tactical doctrine or their inexplicable refusal to surrender when mathematically outmatched. It was their apparently supernatural ability to make you care about things you had never expected to care about, simply by caring about them first. Which was, he supposed, probably why they kept surviving battles they should have lost, and turning enemies into allies with nothing more complicated than shared food and stories about strange Earth creatures who lived in water and stayed with their families forever. It was also why his hatchlings were never going to willingly part with Private Chen. And honestly, Fleet Admiral Korrath was beginning to think that might be the most strategically sound outcome for everyone involved, even if it meant completely rewriting Zephyrian military doctrine to accommodate the occasional adoption of enemy prisoners by homesick children who just wanted someone to sing them to sleep. The Imperium's war machine had conquered star systems and subjugated entire civilizations, but it had finally met its match in two small Zephyrian hatchlings who had decided that a captured human marine made an excellent combination blanket, entertainment system, and surrogate family member. And as Admiral Korrath watched his children sleep peacefully against their chosen human, he reflected that perhaps there were some battles that were won not by superior firepower, but by superior understanding of what really mattered. Even if what really mattered turned out to be ice cream, dolphin stories, and the radical notion that families should stay together forever.